Alright, so in this video we're going to be going through the preferences for the effect panel, and one thing to keep in mind before we start is just that any of the preferences that we're about to change will change the look of our control in this effect panel, but they will not have an effect once applied to After Effects. These are just visual changes to make it a little bit easier to work inside the Pseudo Effect Maker, but they don't actually affect the look of the outputted effect once it's in After Effects. So the first one, you can see the effect panel style by default is set to the newest version of After Effects. If we come in here and change that to say CS6, and save, you can see that there's a slight visual change to the reset button, and if we start adding controls, you can see that the way these controls look is closer to how things were in After Effects CS6. If we go back, we can change that style again, back to CC 2020, and now things appear as they do in the most recent version of After Effects. Again, that's a complete visual change based on personal preference. It allows you to see what your control would look like if you applied it to After Effects CS6, which is possible. You can output your FFX file and import it right into CS6, and that just allows you to see what it would look like in a different version of After Effects without having to import it into each individual version. The next one down is the show slider valid min and valid max. So by default, you can see that our control looks the way it does once it's applied in After Effects. But if we turn this preference on, you can see that now we have the valid min and valid max visible right inside of the effect panel. This allows us to reference those values when we're looking at another effect or if we're scrolled above the selected control options. And we can actually edit these values directly inside of the effect panel without having to bring it up down here. And you can see that those values always match. So that's just a quick way to reference and possibly change the values depending on how you like to work. Next we have show control indices. This is very important when you're writing expressions. So you can see that now, once that's turned on, over here on the right, all of these indices show up, and it allows us to reference those values when we're writing our expressions. This is very important if you're using things like duplicate groups. So if I have a group here and I come down and I duplicate it, you can see that between these two groups, both of them have the exact same controls, and all of those controls are named the exact same thing. What this means is that if we're writing an expression and we reference the name of the control, there's no way to reference the second point or the second 3D point or the slider, because it's only looking at the name and it's always going to use the first control that matches that name that After Effects comes across. So in order to reference these controls in the second group, we need to use their index. And so this just allows you to quickly reference those index without having to count your controls and figure out what those indices are supposed to be. One thing to note about these indices is that I'm going to add another control below this group. And you can see that the last control within this group, the slider, has an index of 20, but the angle that's directly below the group has an index of 22. And that's because when a group closes, it actually takes up an additional index. So that's not a mistake, that's actually how After Effects deals with groups. So every time a group closes, it's actually using an index, which means that every time you add a new group control, it's taking up 2 controls within your effect. That also goes for labels. Labels are actually just empty groups under the hood, but because they are groups, they are still taking up that second index. So for instance, if we have this label here and we add another control underneath it, you can see that the label is 23, but the next control down is 25. That's not a mistake, that's actually how After Effects deals with these values. But those indices just allow us to quickly reference what they are for the specific controls so that we can use them in our expressions. The next preference down, dim group indices, this only has an effect if the show control indices is also enabled. If we turn that on, pretty much does exactly what it says. Now the group's indices have been dimmed, just because within your expressions you're never going to be referencing groups because there's nothing you can really do with them with expressions. So it just kind of visually shows that. Next we have angle and slider start closed. So you can see that as we're adding new angle controls or new slider controls, they start wide open. All this preference does is if we add a new angle control now, you can see it starts closed. Or if we add a new slider control, you can see it starts closed. That's all it does. Again, just depends on how you prefer things to be added to your control. And then the last one we have down here is correct control name placement. Within the Pseudo Effect Maker, you can see that all of these controls that are allowed to be keyframed have the little stopwatch icon. When we turn that off, now when you apply this control, the user or you will not be able to set keyframes on this control. However, you can see that there's still a space there for where the stopwatch used to be, which allows you within the Pseudo Effects Maker to click on that space and turn the keyframes back on. However, within After Effects, when there are no keyframes for control, the name actually shifts to the left. So that's what this preference is referring to. It kind of changes between more accurately representing what it will look like inside of After Effects or making it easier to work with within the Pseudo Effects Maker. So when it's turned off, we can easily toggle keyframes on or off directly inside the Effect panel. When that's turned on, now you can see that the name color has shifted to the left. So now we no longer have the ability to click here to turn keyframes back on. We have to come down and allow keyframes in the control options, but we do have the more accurate visual representation of our control. So it's sort of, those are the two options you have to choose between. Okay, but that's it for the effect panel preferences. In the next video, we'll go over the control panel